good people? You are now listening to another episode of Since We Last Spoke with Danny Foxworth. I am your humble narrator, Danny Foxworth, and good to be back in your presence again for another week. I was a guest on the good brother Brandon Silver's podcast, talking about all things OKC Thunder, and in particular, how I feel the OKC Thunder are going to do this season. And if you haven't checked that episode out, make sure you go back and check that out. It's Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silver. You can find his podcast on all streaming platforms and on YouTube. But while I was a guest on his podcast, when we got to chopping it up, something else sparked in the back of my mind. And I got to give Brandon all the credit for giving me, just inadvertently sparking this idea in my brain. But, you know, as much as I talk about sports, I've never really discussed how I became a fan of the teams that I'm a fan of. So I figured, what better time than now to just, spill my brains a little, give a little brain spillage, talk about how I became a fan of the teams that I became a fan of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it to you in chronological order. I can't talk. So the first team that I truly became a diehard fan of was the North Carolina Tar Heels. This was about back in 1990, 91, in that time period. Now, I will admit, before I became a fan of them, I loosely followed the South Carolina Gamecocks, mainly because of Sterling Sharp, because he was the first college football player that I really remembered. And I just remember being drawn to how great of a football player he was. So I was a Gamecock fan on the periphery, so to speak. But then another backstory, how I became a fan of the teams that I became a fan of is basically I wanted to choose a team that nobody else was rooting for. So fast forward to 1990. Well, let's take it back to 1990, I should say. I was in 5th grade, and this particular day I was home from school. And this was right around the same time that they had the ACC basketball tournament, which is a super big deal down here in the Carolinas. And at that time, I wasn't really familiar with the Tar Heels. The one thing that really made me pay attention is the fact that they had a player by the name of Rick Fox. And the fact that there was another black person on the team that had Fox in his last name, that was one thing. But the second thing that really drew me in was the colors. That powder blue, that Carolina powder blue it's an undeniable color. And those two things were the biggest catalyst in me becoming a fan of the North Carolina Tar Heels. That and the fact that aside from Rick Fox, they also had J.R. Reed, who I was a big fan of. And they also had Eric Montross, who was this very, very stoic 7-foot white guy who had a state trooper haircut. I was like, okay, this is the team I'm going with right here. And it's been on ever since then. And luckily I got them at the right time because, I mean, they were at the top of the pile as far as the college basketball landscape. And they ended up winning the national championship in 1993. And I was in 8th grade. And me and my homie Greg Smith, who was also a fellow Tar Heels fan, we really got to shove it in the face of the fellow Michigan fans, which I'm not going to hold you. I was a huge Fab Five fan myself, but I'm taking Tar Heels over everything. Matter of fact, I remember watching that national championship game at my cousin Kendall's house, and he was huge, like big time into the Fab Five. You couldn't tell him he wasn't Chris Webber and Jalen Rose on the basketball court. And he was so distraught the way that game ended when Chris Webber got that technical foul for calling a timeout whenever they didn't have any timeouts left. And I just remember just running around the house, just jubilant and just relishing in their securing of the national championship back in 93. And then to make it even better, the Lady Tar Heels won the national championship the very next year when Charlotte Smith literally hit a 3-pointer at the buzzer to win the national championship for the Tar Heels, and went from 93. Then they won again in 05, and then again, I believe in 09. It was 09. And that was probably my favorite win because they mopped the floor with Michigan State from beginning to end. That was, to me, that was the most satisfying national championship that I got to witness. And there was a lot of great names that came through North Carolina during that time. I mean, you had Stackhouse, you had Rasheed Wallace, who honestly is my all-time favorite UNC basketball player. Big fan of Sheed. You know, Vince Carter, Anton Jameson, a lot of names, a lot of legends that came through there. And also, I also became a fan of the UNC football team too. This was around that same time. During this time period, they had a running back by the name of Natron Means, who I was a big fan of. And he's the biggest reason why I became a fan of UNC football. They had him and Jason Stanisiak was the quarterback. And then they had Corey Holiday at wide receiver and Bucky Brooks, who used to be an analyst on the NFL Network. He was the other starting wide receiver for the Tar Heels back then. And they had Marcus Jones at defensive tackle and Bracey Walker at safety. Man, that was the team that I really enjoyed watching. And that was the first Mac Brown. That was the first part of the Mac Brown era. And it really got good in the late 90s. They had squads during the mid to late 90s, especially my guy Oscar Davenport. Him, Chris Keldorf, Dre Bly, and Curtis and Leon Johnson. Man, just reminiscing just brings a smile on my face. In 1997, I think that was the best that the Tar Heels did under the first Mac Brown era. If I'm not mistaken, I think they went 12-1 that year. And I think the only loss came at the hands of Florida State, if memory serves me correct. And then he left right before they played in the Gator Bowl to take the head coaching job at the University of Texas. And Carl Torbush ended up being the interim head coach for the Gator Bowl. And they whooped the piss out of Virginia Tech. They beat them 42-3. I'll never forget watching that game. And yeah, Tar Heels, that's my college team right there. And then right around that same time, also in the year 1993, is when I became a fan of the Texas Rangers. Now, during this time period, I live in South Carolina, so I'm deep in the heart of Atlanta Braves country, and everybody and their mom is doing the tomahawk chop. And again, like I said earlier, for me to pick a team, I wanted to choose a team that nobody else was rooting for. And during that time period, I was real big into collecting baseball cards. And I remember seeing they used to have the Topps baseball card commercials come on TV when I was watching cartoons. And they made a big deal out of this guy named Nolan Ryan. And whenever I got my hands on a Nolan Ryan card and I flipped it over to see his career stats and and my mind just could not wrap my mind around the fact that he had 5,714 career strikeouts. Like that's some mythical shit right there. Considering that 3,000 strikeouts was really the career milestone and basically punched your ticket, was an automatic ticket punched into the Hall of Fame. The fact that he had almost twice as many strikeouts as the standard Hall of Fame pitcher was just mind blowing to me. And around that same time, my parents, they put their nickels together and ended up buying a satellite dish. And during this time period, there was one of the stations that we could pick up on the satellite dish was a station in Dallas. I want to say it was KTVT. I'm not 100% sure. But they used to have the Rangers Saturday night game of the week. And that particular game, I can't even remember who they played. But Nolan Ryan was the starting pitcher. He didn't have a particularly good outing. But there was one guy that really made me become a fan of the Texas Rangers was one Julio Franco. Just off the strength of his batting stance, because matter of fact, I'm gonna get this baseball bat right here to show you what his stance looked like. So if you're watching the video on YouTube, he basically, when he stood in the batter's box, he had the top of the bat was basically facing towards the pitcher. And I'd never seen such an unorthodox batting stance in my life. And he just He just flat out tore the cover off that ball during the entire game. And that was he was the number one reason why I became a Texas Rangers fan. And it's been on ever since. And the amount of funny looks I would get from my classmates when I would show up to school, specifically on the first day wearing Texas Rangers gear. And I'm like, dude, you're in Atlanta Braves country. What the hell is wrong with you? Why the Rangers? And then I gave them the reasons why. I'm like, all right, whatever, weirdo. But I mean, it didn't hurt my feelings any. And they had a pretty good run in the 90s, like in the mid to late 90s when Johnny Oates was the skipper. I believe they won the AL West division title, I believe 3 straight years. And my all-time favorite Texas Rangers player was a player that also played during that time period. He was an outfielder by the name of Rusty Greer. He kind of reminded me, to me, he was like Josh Hamilton before Josh Hamilton, just played hard. And as a result, he ended up on the injured list quite a bit, but the man could hit for average. He could hit for power. And he was redheaded too, which was a rarity in Major League Baseball. So I was always a huge Rusty Greer fan. And the true high notes of being a Rangers fan were the Ron Washington years in the 2010s, where they went to back-to-back World Series in 2010 and 2011. And the first trip in 2010, they just ran into a buzzsaw with the San Francisco Giants. They had Matt Cain and Tim Lincecum, and they ended up losing the series in 5 games. It couldn't do nothing with those two. And then they had Brian Wilson as their just standout closer. But then they went right back the next year and went back to the World Series. They beat Detroit in the ALCS in 2011 and punched their ticket to the World Series. And it was a dogfight with the St. Louis Cardinals. They were on there in Game 6. It looked like they were in cruise control, and it looked like the title was coming back with them to Arlington, but it just wasn't the case. Bottom of the 9th, 2 outs, literally 1 strike away from being world champions. And I'll never forget, Neftali Feliz was the Rangers closer, and he threw a pitch, and it got the ball. I cannot remember who it was. It was either David Freese or Alan Craig. And it took a long time for me to like them again, because they were such a thorn in my side during the World Series. One of them hit the ball to the warning track. All Nelson Cruz had to do was catch the ball at the wall to secure the final out, and the Rangers could be world champions. I literally had my Facebook post ready, locked and loaded. I was just ready for him to make that catch so I could hit send and I could party, because I've been a fan since 1993, and none of the pro teams that I rooted for ever won a world title in anything. And so he missed the ball. He mistimed the ball on the fly on the warning track. 2-run score. They sent in 2-run score for the Cardinals. They sent it in the extra innings, and they traded runs back and forth in the 10th inning. The game remained tied. And then in the bottom of the 11th, when I saw Mark Lowe take the mound, I immediately cut my TV off because I knew what the outcome was going to be. And sure enough, I believe it was Alan Craig that hit a walk-off bomb to win Game 6. And all the momentum shifted towards the Cardinals, and they ended up winning Game 7 the following night, and they won the world championship. But again, delayed but not denied, because here came the taskmaster himself, Bruce Bochy, who was the new manager of the Texas Rangers last year in 2023. And the 2 years prior to that, the Rangers were under the leadership of Chris Woodward, who he wasn't a good manager. He was the Dodgers' former third base coach. And his last 2 years there, they lost. Second to last year, they lost 100 games. Then his last year with the Rangers, they went 68-94, and then they hired Bruce Bochy in 2023, and they end up winning the World Series. They hobbled into the playoffs, but they got hot at the right time, to the point where they literally went 11-0 on the road during the playoffs, which has never been done in MLB history. And my guy Adolis Garcia, he got hot, and the team was they played as such a staunch, like a big time cohesive unit, and they ended up winning the World Series. And that was something that I quite literally waited 30 years for. And that was such an incredible feeling. Today, which is Wednesday, was actually the 1 year anniversary of them winning the ALCS title and clinching their World Series berth. So, man, that was awesome. That was awesome. And then as far as my NBA team, during the 90s, again, everybody and their mom was a fan of the Chicago Bulls, and I wanted to pick a team that, again, nobody else was rooting for. So it was around this time I became familiar with Shawn Kemp and Gary Payton of the Seattle Supersonics. And we didn't really get a whole lot of Sonics games down here in South Carolina, even though we had cable. For some reason, it was just hard to find Sonics games on the satellite. And I just remember seeing Shawn Kemp and Gary Payton always on NBA Inside Stuff during the jam session segment. And I took a liking to those two players in particular. And it wasn't until the 93 NBA playoffs, especially in the first round, and I believe they played the Warriors in the first round in 93. And that's when I really became a fan of the Sonics. I was like, okay, they have my attention. I like the way the squad operates. You had Kemp, you had Gary Payton, you had Derek McKee at forward, you had Benoit Benjamin at center. Who was their shooting guard at the time? I want to say it'll come to me. But the thing that really made me become a fan of the Seattle Supersonics was when they played the Phoenix Suns in the Western Conference Finals. They ended up losing in 7 games, but that team, they had so much heart, and that's the thing that really drew me to the Sonics. And since then, I was like, you know what? I'm going to be a Sonics fan. And I picked the right and the wrong time to be a Sonics fan, because the following year, they ended up being the best team in the NBA. I believe they were 64-19 was their regular season record, and they clinched the number 1 seed in the playoffs. And then the Denver Nuggets happened. They ended up getting eliminated by the 8th seeded Denver Nuggets as a 1 seed, which was the first time in NBA history that ever happened. And the next day, my friends let me have it. I couldn't talk shit about anybody else's team without them going, "Shut up, Seattle." And I really had no comeback for that. And to make things worse, the next year, they clinched the number 2 seed in the West and then get knocked out of the first round again by the 7th seeded LA Lakers. Those were 2 of the worst sports years in my life, particularly that first round loss elimination to the Denver Nuggets. And the late, great Dikembe Mutombo on the floor, holding the ball in his hands, and announcing that Mutombo embracing the ball. Boy, that was tough. That was tough. But, it's not going to be valleys all the time. Then they reached their peak after those back-to-back first-round losses. They end up making it to the NBA Finals. They knock off the Utah Jazz. I believe that was in 7 games, too, in the Western Conference Finals. And they ended up facing the Chicago Bulls. And they really showed some serious, serious heart during that finals run, because I'm not even going to hold you. I thought the Bulls were going to sweep the Sonics. And it looked like that in the beginning, because I believe the Bulls took a 3-0 lead. And then the Sonics got 2 victories before ultimately losing the NBA Finals in 6 games. But again, that team was resilient. You had Kemp, you had Payton, Hersey Hawkins, my guy Big Smooth, Sam Perkins, Frank Bukowski. Who else was on that team? Vincent Askew, David Wingate, Steve Scheffler, Irvin Johnson. Irvin Johnson was trash though, but they were my squad. And there were some very lean years after Kemp and Payton left, and then Ray Allen became the superstar for the Sonics. And then once the Ray Allen period started to die down, and then they started to go in a younger direction, and the team just became sorrier and sorrier. And then they drafted Kevin Durant and Kevin Durant's rookie year. I believe that was the last year the Sonics were a team, and they ended up going 20-62. And then the following year, they draft Russell Westbrook in 2008, and then in 2008, they end up moving to Oklahoma City, where they became the Oklahoma City Thunder. Now, like I said when I was on Brandon's podcast, if I were a resident of Seattle, I would probably feel a way about them leaving Seattle. But since I really had no emotional ties from a local standpoint, I was like, I'm gonna stay with this squad and root for them as a member of the Oklahoma as they turn into the Oklahoma City Thunder. So that first year in 2008, they went 23-59. And I was like, man, is this team ever going to get good again? And then I believe the following year they went to the playoffs, if I'm not mistaken, and they ended up losing to the Lakers in the first round. But that was the first time really seeing what Russell Westbrook was made of. And I'm like, all right, this won't be long. The NBA, the rest of the league is going to see what this dude is made of too, because I wasn't very familiar with Russell Westbrook at the time with him playing at UCLA, but I saw the potential, and that potential was unleashed. And then 2012, unexpectedly, that young core of KD, Russell Westbrook, and James Harden ended up going all the way to the NBA Finals. And I was like, wow, this team is ahead of schedule, but they caught lightning in the bottle, but that lightning in the bottle just wasn't enough to stave off the Miami Heat, who won the NBA title that year. But things are looking back up. We got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren. Future's looking bright for them. They're pretty much projected to be the top team coming out of the Western Conference, and they're still the youngest team in the league. They were the youngest team to clinch a 1 seed last year. So the rebuild is ahead of schedule, but we're going to see what the future holds for the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I think that future is going to be extremely bright. Now, moving on to the NFL. Again, during the early 90s, especially if you grew up in the Charleston area, everybody and their mom was either a Steelers or a Cowboys fan. And again, I wanted to pick a team that nobody else was rooting for. And during this time period, the Carolina Panthers became the newest NFL franchise. It was them and the Jacksonville Jaguars who came in the league at the same time. And I'm like, you know what? That's super cool that the NFL has a team in the Carolinas. And that right there was enough reason for me to become a Panthers fan. And early they were pretty impressive. Their second year in the league, they ended up making it to the NFC Championship. Actually, I think the Jaguars actually made it to the AFC Championship their second year in existence, which is just pretty damn impressive. And there have been some highs and some lows. I remember the first Panthers game I ever attended was September 30th, 2007. They played the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and boy, they were sorry as hell. David Carr was the starting quarterback. That game wasn't all that memorable. I think they ended up losing, it was either 20-6 or 20-9. And David Carr stunk it up. I mean, the crowd just booed the hell out of him in towards the third quarter. So much so to the point where they kept chanting for Matt Moore, who was the backup QB, to come in the game to replace him, because he was not playing up to snuff, to the point where the crowd was chanting, "We want more. We want more." And then they asked David Carr about that in the post-game press conference. And this fool was like, "Yeah, I get it. The crowd's frustrated. We want more. We want more points." So I'm like, get this man off my team. I don't want him on this team no more. Bum. So yeah, that was a pretty forgettable game. Well, that, and I also do remember Cadillac Williams, the Buccaneers running back. He ended up blowing his knee out during that game too. But aside from that, that game was not memorable. The worst Panthers game I ever attended was back in 2010 when they played the Baltimore Ravens, and this was during they went 2-14 that year, and they were decimated at quarterback. I mean, Jimmy Clausen was out for the year, and they signed Vinny Testaverde, and I believe he tore his Achilles. And so what they did was the week leading up to the game against the Ravens, out of all the quarterbacks they could have signed, they hit up a guy by the name of Brian St. Pierre, who had been out of the NFL for 5 years. And at the time of the Panthers calling him, he was a stay-at-home dad. He was a stay-at-home dad. And that game went about as bad as you would expect. And I will say the ticket, I enjoyed it because, number one, the tickets were cheap. And I got to see Ray Lewis and Ed Reed play. And so fast forward to the fourth quarter. I don't even remember what the final score was. I just know we got our ass kicked. And this is the first time ever in my life that I've seen a quarterback throw back-to-back, throw pick sixes on back-to-back drives. He threw an interception to Ray Lewis, who ran it back for a score. Then the very next drive, he throws an interception to Ed Reed, who gets, I believe he ran all the way back to like the 10-yard line. Then he pitched it to DeJuan Landry, who scored. And I was like, I had never seen, that's like some Haley's Comet shit, seeing a quarterback throw back-to-back pick sixes. But yeah, that was a rough go. That was an incredibly rough season to go through. But help was on the way in the form of Cam Newton, who they drafted with the number 1 overall pick the next year. And, he had his growing pains as a rookie. He took a lot of criticism with him, especially with him wearing the towel over his head and whatnot. But that 2015 season, man, I tell you what, that was the season he won the MVP. The Panthers went 15-1. And that season was special because my mom, who's really not into sports, she became familiar with something that it was a promotion that Krispy Kreme Donuts would do during that season. It was something called Victory Monday. So the Monday after every Panthers win, every Krispy Kreme shop in North and South Carolina, their box of dozen donuts, they would be $3.99. So every Monday, Mom would ask me, how did the Panthers do? Did the Panthers win? I like, they won. She was like, she would just be like, yes, I'm going to Krispy Kreme to get some donuts. So yeah, that was lovely. They they made it to the Super Bowl, but they lost to the Denver Broncos. But that was a hell of a ride. And it was that Super Bowl, which the Panthers lost, that really changed my opinion on how personal I take my sports team losing. I was down. I mean, I was pissed off for all of 5 or 6 minutes. I sat in my car and I said, you know what? I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to have a nice, relaxing sleep, and I'm going to wake up the next morning and everything's going to be fine. And I'm not going to take these losses personal anymore, ever again. And that's been one of the best things I could have ever done, because the way I see people just react whenever their team loses, I'm like, bro, it ain't that serious, bro. You got to get a grip. Unless you have money on it, I understand. But other than that, like, nah, bro, you're doing way too much over a team losing. This team don't care about you. Relax. But the Panthers, they're in a very bad space right now. If you listen to my Candle podcast, A Wicked Good Time, that's where I go to air my grievances, because I normally record on Sundays, and this is fresh off of a Panthers loss. After David Tepper bought the Panthers in 2018, this man literally inherited a playoff team that went 11-5 in 2017. And since then, the team has gone 32-74. Literally have not had a winning season since David Tepper became the owner. They were 2-15 last year. They're 1-5 this year. Either 1-5 or 1-6. Either way, they're the worst team in the league right now. And it doesn't look like things are going to change anytime soon. But you know what? Speaking of attending games, I want to go back to the Thunder real quick, because I failed to mention that. Blame my mind, not my heart. I've been to Thunder games when they played at the Hornets and at the Hawks, but back in 2017, I was like, you know what? I'm going to give myself a Christmas gift. So I always wanted to attend the OKC home game, because on TV, it just looked incredible. Like, the crowd is rabid. It almost feels like a college atmosphere watching it on television. So I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to get a ticket to watch a Thunder home game. And I got a ticket for KD's return back to OKC as a member of the Golden State Warriors. That was February 11th, 2017. And man, that was one of the most incredible experiences ever. That crowd was so electric, even though the team was bad, and even though they got the snot beat out of them by Golden State. Every time KD went to the free throw line, they kept calling him Cupcake. Every time Russ went to the free throw line, they kept chanting MVP real loud. And I think they ended up losing. Gosh, Thunder must have lost by like 25 or 30 points. But yeah, I definitely got to get back. I got to get back there again this season. But anyway, hitting the fast forward button. Now, the WNBA team I root for is the Las Vegas Aces. Now, excuse me, I'll say I've been a big supporter of the WNBA literally since its inception because of one of my high school classmates who I had on the podcast. Shout out to Yusha Gilmore. She got drafted by the Indiana Fever back in 2000, but she was actually the person that made me fall in love with the women's basketball. But I've been really, like I said, I've been following the WNBA since it started, but I didn't really have a team to latch on to. I've kind of followed the Charlotte's thing on the periphery. Shout out to Don Staley and Andrea Stinson. Andrea Stinson was one of my favorite players ever. She could flat out hoop. She was a bucket. But it was the Las Vegas Aces. The reason why I became an Aces fan, it was really because of three things. Number one, because of Asia Wilson, her being from South Carolina, and she's also left-handed like I am. That was number one. Number two, I was a huge Kelsey Plum fan. She was the NCAA all-time leading scorer before Caitlin Clark broke her record, and she was also left-handed. So that's two reasons. And then the third reason was Bill Laimbeer was the head coach. And Bill Laimbeer was always one of my favorite players as a kid. So I was like, you know what? That's a good enough reason for me to become an Aces fan. And it's been lovely. I gotta say, they would make noise in the playoffs, but they just could not get over the hump with Bill Laimbeer's style of play because he just did not believe in the team shooting threes at a normal clip. And that he ended up getting fired, in which they replaced him with Becky Hammond, who was an assistant on Greg Popovich's staff prior to getting the head coaching job with the Aces. And the three-pointer started flowing more freely. And Asia Wilson, her game started to mature even more. And they won the WNBA championship back in 2022, which is that was the first pro team that I ever rooted for that ever won a world title in anything. They get close, but it's just my teams have made it to the finals, but they just couldn't close the deal until 2022. And that was a beautiful feeling. Coupled that with them going back to back again in 2023, and couple that with the Texas Rangers winning the World Series in 2023 as well. It was a good time to be a fan of the teams that I was a fan of. And the Aces, they ran into a better team with the New York Liberty this year. So shout out to the Liberty, who ended up winning the WNBA title, their first title this year. Man, I tell you what, WNBA the future is bright. And I'm looking forward to see what the future holds with this league. And lastly, I'm a semi-casual hockey fan. I'm still under the belief that hockey is the best live sport to watch, hands down. Now, I've been to quite a few Stingrays games. I got to get back to those Stingrays games this year. I've been slacking. But all this time, I've watched hockey, again, just super casually. I never really picked an NHL team. And so I actually made the decision this morning that I'm going to root for the Nashville Predators. And honestly, excuse me, no real reason why, but that's the team that I'm going with. So now I just got to do my homework with the squad, figure out who the players are, and this, that, and the third. So yeah, that's my newest homework assignment, is to really get invested with all things Nashville Predators. And yeah, that's pretty much a synopsis of how I became a fan of the teams that I became a fan of. And again, This has been another episode of Since We Last Spoke with Danny Foxworth. So thank y'all for listening. Make sure you like, download, and subscribe to Since We Last Spoke. Make sure you tell a friend about the podcast. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find me at Danny Foxworth 843. There you can find all the videos for all of my podcast episodes for this podcast, as well as my baseball podcast, which is At the Plate with Danny Foxworth, my podcast about candles, which is A Wicked Good Time with Danny Foxworth, and my other podcast, which is Growing Up Low Country with Liz and Danny, which, well, is pretty self-explanatory in the title. Liz and I talk about growing up low country. And again, thank you all so much for tuning in. And until next time, y'all be good. Peace.